In Section 2 of Lecture 1, I will draw from the aesthetics of the art historical canon to discuss how coloniality and colonialism has manifested through a visual narrative that has constructed the fallacy of the imaginary or disappearing Indian. So the first work I want to talk about is Allegory of America, From New Interventions of Modern Times. And this is plate 1 of 19 in the series Nova Ruperta. It's by the artist Theodore Gal, and he was from the Netherlands. And this was produced circa 1600. So this is a very early demonstration of how early colonists and explorers came to view the indigenous peoples they encountered in the Americas. I'm going to read directly from the Met's website and their description of this plate. This is the first plate from the series entitled Nova Ruperta, which surveys new inventions and discoveries made during the Renaissance from a European perspective. In this engraving, the Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci is shown as he first encounters America. Stradanus presents the continent as an allegorical figure, a sexualized young woman gesturing toward Vespucci from her hammock. She wears only a feathered headdress and skirt, her club abandoned against the tree at the right, where an anteater is shown feasting. Set behind her in the rolling landscape are other animals associated with the Americas, a horse and a bear, also depicted as a scene of cannibalism. So these allegorical depictions that were made around this time were exclusively made by cisgendered white European men. And there's a couple details in this painting that are very specifically colonial from a European perspective. So I'll read again from the Met's website. Here, Vespucci carries a staff with a crucifix at its pinnacle and a banner of the Southern Cross. He also holds a brass mariner's astrolabe, which helped him navigate the seas to find new lands to explore and people to exploit on behalf of Spain and Portugal. Vespucci undertook several expeditions to South and Central America between 1497 and 1504, spurred by Christopher Columbus's earlier journey. In the preparatory drawing for this print, Vespucci is shown naming the allegorical figure America, a feminized version of his own name. So there's also some very interesting depictions in this plate that show us how early colonists and would-be settlers saw the indigenous peoples they were encountering in the Americas. So of course, something that strikes me right away is this nude allegorical figure. She's quite genderqueer. She is a feminized figure, but there's also this sort of masculinization of her figure that makes her appear very other to white Western femininities. And yet she is so docile, she's so submissive, she's ready to be conquered and perhaps sexually by Vespucci himself in this painting, or this plate rather. And she's depicted as one with the nature and the flora and the fauna around her. She's very much representative of the environment that surrounds her. She's exotic to the settler and explorer, just as the animals that surround her are, and just as these horrid cannibalistic acts that are being depicted in the allegory are. And it's interesting that this is the depiction that they chose to show of indigenous peoples, one that was cannibalistic, one that was perhaps sociopathic. And what's interesting about these allegories is they always place the inherent ownership of colonial territory, this terra nullius, in this relationship between the colonist and his, sort of penal or sexual desire for the lands in the America. And this is often represented by a woman figure, a Indian maiden, and her sort of sexual awakening alongside his conquering of the Americas. But alongside these sort of romantic allegories of indigenous women, there exists this extreme exoticism and also othering of indigenous peoples in a derogatory fashion when we look in the background and we see this depiction of a cannibalistic community. So, I want to jump ahead a bit because I want to discuss how these rhetorics of coloniality in North and South America would go on to inform social cultures in the late 1800s and 1900s around the idea of American progress. So, the painting I want to discuss to look through this idea of American progress is itself entitled American Progress. It was a painting completed by John Gast in 1872. And really, American Progress is a seminal example of American Western painting. And what we see here is a depiction of Western expansion. This was a period of time wherein both the United States and Canada was looking to move its economies and its peoples westward in order to colonize and settle as much territories as possible in what will become America and Canada. And the rhetorics that would come to inform these projects of expansion or settler colonialism were those same rhetorics that viewed indigenous peoples as inherently taboo, as inherently backwards, as inherently alternative to American progress and projects of American modernism. So in this painting, we can see that American progress or contemporary settler colonialism is depicted in the figure of a white, angelic woman who positively floats through the air. She carries with her some form of document in her hand, and also, so the written word, and also she carries with her power lines that she's slowly setting up as she goes. Behind her, a train comes, and with it, the progress of the future, of modernity, of everything that indigenous peoples are inherently against, or so we're told by this depiction. We also see the brave farmers who are moving westward to settle these territories alongside their colonist kin who ride horses and herd buffalo and take these carriages with their families westward to settle territories. And as they move westward, we also see the indigenous peoples on the left hand portion of the canvas, and they are moving into relative darkness, away from the light, away from modernism, away from colonialism. So, the next artist I want to discuss is Edward S. Curtis. And Edward S. Curtis was an American photographer, an ethnologist, and he traveled the so called American West, and along his way, he photographed the indigenous peoples he met. The thing about his work is he really meant to depict a so called dying indigenous peoples. This is what he saw his life work to be about. He saw that the progress was coming to the American West. This progress meant that indigenous peoples would either have to matriculate into American society, or they would have to, in essence, die out. And even if it wasn't a literal genocide, a literal process of their communities dying from disease or warfare or other such terrible colonial acts, there was an epistemological dying out that was intended as well, the death of their cultures, their language, their aesthetics. And so, with every image that Curtis was capturing, it was as if he was simultaneously wishing the indigenous peoples he was capturing to their graves. He wanted to encapsulate them, archive them, and own them. And this is what comes to mind when we think about the history of photography as it affects indigenous peoples. Until recent history, things like photography or film were things that were only made to exploit and capture non consensual images of indigenous peoples. So we have to think about forms of contemporary art history very much as articulations of visual sovereignty, very much as indigenous peoples turning the lens back at the people who colonized them and defining their own representations against these forms of the disappearing Indian that were so popularized during this moment of so called American progress and Western expansion. So, the next work I want to discuss is an oil painting by George Catlin entitled Dance to the Burdash. And this was painted in 1830. George Catlin was a lawyer, a painter, an author, and a traveler. and he's renowned for his work in portraiture of Native Americans in the so called Old West. He also interestingly researched and documented their views on mouth breathing, so he was quite the voyeur in a lot of different areas. And the interesting thing about this depiction is it's depicting a ceremony that has been lost to the peoples that it is being celebrated by in this depiction. And namely, this is evidence of a form of two spirit ceremony. So, when I say two spirit, what I'm referring to is a historical indigenous person who was seen to embody things that we would consider today to be gender non normativity, resisting the gender binary. And sometimes folks discuss this as instances of a contemporary connection to lesbian and gay identities. But it's a bit confusing because pre-colonial indigenous genders in many communities in North America was not as simple as just being about men and women. So I'm not sure that you can ascribe those labels of gay and lesbian to the forms of relationships that were happening between these historical two-spirit folks. But they certainly offer us a window into considering how we can think beyond colonial gender binaries in the ways that we approach research or thought about Indigenous communities. So, in this depiction, it is a very voyeuristic depiction of Indigenous communities. Don't get me wrong, George Catlin was a very exploitative explorer and documenter, and I don't think that he dealt sensitively with the subject matter that he was attempting to depict. But why I did want to show this work is I want us to think a little bit also about minor histories of colonial depictions. So while this is a arguably violent depiction of a very sacred ceremony, we can look to this painting, and many queer, trans, two spirit historians have indeed looked to this painting to say, look, there is evidence that we did exist in some sort of revered state. There was a form of ceremony for us where all of our peoples in our community, they would come together and they would celebrate how special we are as peoples and how special we are to the integrity of our whole community. So while we have to be critical of colonial depictions, I want us to challenge ourselves to do reparative viewings and readings of the cultural objects that we are going to explore throughout this seminar and find meaning that can perhaps repair these depictions in some way and really give the life back to the people who are being depicted.